He thought he had it all: the perfect life, the perfect fiancé, and the satisfaction of seeing his ex-wife Sarah seemingly struggle after their bitter divorce. When he heard she was planning a budget wedding, he couldn't resist mocking her. He laughed with his friends, posted smug comments online, and pictured her in a dingy church hall with a cheap buffet. But while he was busy broadcasting his scorn, Sarah was boarding a private jet. Her budget wedding wasn't about a lack of money, it was about a level of wealth he couldn't even comprehend. This is the story of how a man's petty cruelty blinded him to the fact that his ex-wife wasn't just moving on, she was moving up to a world of unimaginable luxury and marrying a billionaire on his own private island. Mark Copeland adjusted the silk tie knotted at his throat, his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office giving him a smug sense of satisfaction. Below him, the city sprawled out, a concrete kingdom he felt he had conquered. He had everything a man could want: a thriving business built on aggressive acquisitions, a sleek penthouse apartment, and a fiancée, Tiffany, who was as beautiful and meticulously curated as the art on his walls. Life was good. Life was, in a word, perfect. His phone buzzed on the polished mahogany desk. It was a message from an old mutual friend, one of the few remaining ties to his previous life, his life with Sarah. He opened it, a smirk already playing on his lips. The message contained a screenshot of a social media post from Sarah's sister. It was a picture of a simple hand-drawn wedding invitation. The paper looked like recycled cardstock. The calligraphy was sweet but amateurish, and the details were sparse. Join us to celebrate the marriage of Sarah and Leo. St. Jude's Chapel, followed by a brunch reception. Mark let out a short, sharp laugh. St. Jude's. He knew the place. It was a tiny, crumbling stone chapel on the outskirts of town, wedged between a laundromat and a convenience store. It was the kind of place you went for a quick, no-fuss ceremony when you couldn't afford anything better. And a brunch reception. He could just picture it: stale croissants, a watery fruit salad, and cheap, sparkling wine in plastic flutes. He immediately forwarded the screenshot to his group chat with his closest friends, all cut from the same cloth of new money and relentless ambition. His caption: "Looks like my ex is finally tying the knot. Hope she saved up for the good paper plates. LMAO." The replies came in a flood of laughing emojis and derisive comments. "St. Jude's more like St. Desperate's," one wrote. Another added, "A brunch wedding. How utterly quaint. Did she get a Groupon for it?" Mark felt a familiar, ugly thrill. It was the same feeling he got when he closed a hostile takeover, the same rush of superiority that had fueled his rise. He had left Sarah behind, convinced she would wither without him. Their divorce had been his decision, a calculated move to upgrade his life. He had told her she was holding him back, that her simple tastes and lack of ambition were an anchor on his soaring trajectory. He'd been generous in the settlement, or so he told everyone, giving her the small suburban house they had shared and enough to live on for a year or two. In his mind, it was a golden parachute into a life of mediocrity. Now, this pathetic little wedding was confirmation of everything he believed. She was exactly where he had predicted she would be: small, simple, and utterly insignificant. He couldn't resist twisting the knife. He found Sarah's sister's post and left a public comment, a thinly veiled jab disguised as well wishes. "So happy for you, Sarah. The chapel looks cozy. Wishing you all the best on your big day. Let me know if you need anything, my treat." And the condescension was so thick it was almost suffocating. That evening, he took Tiffany to a Michelin-starred restaurant where the tasting menu cost more than the average person's monthly rent. As they sipped vintage champagne, he regaled her with the story of Sarah's budget wedding. "It's just so sad," Tiffany said, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. Her diamond engagement ring, a rock the size of a small bird's egg, caught the light flashing fire. I mean, after being married to you, you'd think she'd have higher standards. That's the thing, darling, Mark said, swirling his wine. She doesn't have standards. She has hobbies. Pottery, gardening, volunteering at the animal shelter. All very noble, but they don't exactly pay the bills, do they? He leaned in his voice, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I honestly feel a little sorry for her. And this new guy, Leo, can you imagine he's probably some bland beige accountant who thinks a weekend trip to a bed and breakfast is the height of luxury? Tiffany giggled a tinkling sound that always seemed to gratify him. Well, I'm glad you escaped. Our wedding is going to be the event of the year. A full-page spread in Vogue at the very least. Mark smiled. Their own wedding was planned for the following spring at a sprawling estate in Tuscany. They had hired a celebrity wedding planner, a floral designer flown in from Paris, and a guest list that was a who's who of the city's elite. It was going to be a spectacle, a testament to his success, his power, his impeccable taste. He raised his glass. To us, he said, and to leaving the past where it belongs. But as he drank, a small, nagging thought pricked at the edge of his consciousness. He hadn't heard from Sarah directly in over a year. Their divorce had been finalized through lawyers, a cold and impersonal process. He had expected her to fight, to scream, to cry. Instead, she had been quiet, composed, and unnervingly serene. She had agreed to his terms with a simple, handwritten note that said, I wish you peace, Mark. At the time, he had interpreted her calmness as defeat. Now, for a fleeting moment, he wondered if it had been something else entirely. He pushed the thought away. It was ridiculous. He was the winner. He had won at business, he had won at life, and he had most certainly won the divorce. Sarah's sad little wedding was just the final proof. He was sure of it. While Mark was basking in the glow of his own perceived superiority, Sarah was sitting on the floor of a light-filled studio surrounded by bolts of silk and lace. The studio, with its soaring ceilings and panoramic views of the ocean, was a far cry from the cramped suburban house Mark imagined her in. After the divorce, she had sold the house, a place that held more painful memories than happy ones, and moved to a secluded coastal town, a place where the air was clean and the people didn't know her as Mark Copeland's ex-wife. She was sketching in a leather-bound notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. Across from her sat a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a chic, understated sense of style. This was Anya, a name whispered, in the most exclusive circles, a wedding planner who didn't advertise and only took on clients through personal referral. Anya's fee for a consultation alone was more than Mark's monthly mortgage payment on his penthouse. I want it to feel like a whisper, not a shout, Sarah said, looking up from her sketchbook. Elegant, timeless, but most of all private. The only people there will be the people who truly matter to us. Anya nodded, a small, approving smile on her lips. And the dress? Sarah pointed to a swatch of delicate, hand-embroidered lace from a small, family-owned mill in Lyon. This. I want something simple, something that moves with me. Nothing that feels like a costume. There was a quiet confidence about Sarah that had been absent during her years with Mark. He had been the sun in their solar system, and she had been a small planet trapped in his orbit, her own light dimmed by his overwhelming glare. The divorce, as painful as it had been a liberation. She had rediscovered herself, her passions, her own worth. She had started a small bespoke pottery business, and to her surprise, it had taken off. Her pieces, with their organic shapes and delicate glazes, were now sought after by high-end interior designers and collectors. She wasn't a billionaire, but she was successful in her own right, and more importantly, she was happy. And then there was Leo. She had met him at a charity auction where one of her pottery collections was being sold. He hadn't been the highest bidder, but he had sought her out afterwards, not to talk about her work, but to talk about her. He was quiet, unassuming, with a kind smile and a genuine curiosity about the world. He had introduced himself simply as Leo Sterling, a software developer. He hadn't mentioned that the software he had developed was a revolutionary piece of AI technology that had been acquired by a major tech giant for a sum with 9 zeros. Leo was the antithesis of Mark. He listened more than he talked. He was more interested in her thoughts than in impressing her with his own. He celebrated her successes without feeling threatened by them. He loved her for who she was, not for who he thought she should be. He was, in a word, home. When he proposed, it wasn't with a grand public gesture, but on a quiet Tuesday evening, as they were cooking dinner together in the kitchen of his surprisingly modest beach house. He had presented her with a simple, elegant ring with a single perfect sapphire, her birthstone. "I don't want to own you, Sarah," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just want to love you." Their wedding preparations were a reflection of their relationship, private, personal, and deeply meaningful. The St. Jude's Chapel, on the invitation, was a deliberate piece of misdirection, a little inside joke between them. Anya had suggested it as a way to throw people like Mark off the scent. The real St. Jude's was a historic, deconsecrated chapel from the 17th century that Leo had purchased and restored on his private estate in the Caribbean. The brunch reception was another piece of artful subterfuge. It would in fact be an elaborate multi-course meal prepared by a world-renowned chef who was a personal friend of Leo's. The guests, a small curated list of their closest family and friends, had been flown in on private jets and were staying in luxurious villas scattered across the estate. Sarah was aware of Mark's mockery. Her sister had shown her the comment on her post, her eyes flashing with anger. "Can you believe the nerve of that man?" she had fumed. After everything he put you through, Sarah had simply smiled, a serene, unbothered smile that had infuriated her sister even more. "It's okay," she had said. "Let him think what he wants. It doesn't matter." And it didn't. Mark's opinion of her was no longer a mirror in which she saw her own reflection. It was just noise, the distant, irrelevant chatter of a man she no longer knew. She was too busy building a life filled with love, respect, and a quiet, unshakable joy. As Anya packed up her swatches and notebooks, she paused at the door. "You know," she said, her sharp eyes softening for a moment, "in my line of work, I see a lot of weddings, a lot of money, a lot of spectacle. But it's rare to see this much happiness." Sarah looked out at the ocean, the late afternoon sun turning the water to molten gold. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "I'm a very lucky woman," she said. And she meant it. She was marrying the love of her life. The setting, the dress, the food, it was all just beautiful window dressing. The real treasure was the man who was waiting for her at the end of the aisle. A man who saw her, truly saw her, and loved what he saw. That was a luxury no amount of money could buy. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the Caribbean sun painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Sarah awoke not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to the gentle melody of tropical birds and the soft sigh of the waves on the shore below her villa. A gentle breeze, fragrant with the scent of salt and jasmine, drifted through the open balcony doors. She slipped out of bed and padded onto the terrace, a silk robe draped over her shoulders. Below her, the island unfolded like a secret garden. Emerald green hills tumbled down to pristine, white sand beaches, fringed with turquoise water so clear she could see the coral reefs teeming with life beneath the surface. This was Leo's island, his sanctuary. He had named it Serafina, a name he'd confessed was inspired by the sense of peace he felt when he was with her. There was no frantic rush, no army of stylists and makeup artists creating a frenzied buzz. Just Anya, calm and efficient, and a hairstylist and makeup artist who were more like old friends, their quiet chatter a soothing balm. They worked with a gentle, unhurried grace, enhancing Sarah's natural beauty rather than masking it. Her hair was styled in a soft, loose chignon, with a few delicate tendrils escaping to frame her face. Her makeup was luminous and understated, making her look like the best version of herself. When she finally slipped into her dress, it was a moment of quiet revelation. The hand-embroidered lace felt like a second skin, the simple, elegant lines flowing around her as she moved. It was the antithesis of the stiff, overwrought gowns that Tiffany would undoubtedly favor. This dress was made for dancing, for walking on the beach, for embracing her new husband. Her sister, who was her maid of honor, watched her with tears in her eyes. "You look happy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Genuinely, truly happy." "I am," Sarah said, her own eyes misting over. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away, Mark Copeland was having a very different kind of morning. He was at his desk, a scowl on his face as he barked orders at a subordinate on the phone. The deal he had been working on, a hostile takeover of a smaller rival, had hit a snag. The company was putting up more of a fight than he had anticipated, and it was costing him time and money. He hung up the phone with a frustrated sigh and glanced at the calendar. It was Saturday, Sarah's wedding day. A cruel smile touched his lips. He imagined her in the drab little chapel, surrounded by a handful of relatives, her new husband looking nervous and out of his depth. He pictured the sad little brunch afterwards, the awkward small talk, the cheap wine. The thought gave him a petty, satisfying thrill. He decided to check social media, hoping for a glimpse of the pathetic affair. He searched for Sarah's sister's profile, scrolling through her posts, looking for any updates, any photos, any shred of evidence to confirm his assumptions. But there was nothing. No pictures of the cozy chapel, no shots of the quaint brunch, no posts tagged with #Sarah and Leo get hitched. There was only silence. A strange sense of unease began to creep over him. It was unlike her sister to be so quiet on such a big day. She was a prolific social media user, documenting every minor event in her life with a flurry of the photos and hashtags. The silence was odd. He tried searching for St. Jude's Chapel, but the results were a jumble of low-quality images of the rundown building, none of them recent. He even tried searching for Leo Sterling, but the name was so common, it was like looking for a needle in a digital haystack. There were thousands of them, none of whom seemed to be getting married that day. His frustration grew. He wanted to see it. He needed to see it. He needed the visual confirmation that he had been right, that she was diminished without him. The lack of information was more infuriating than any amount of gloating on her part would have been. Back on Serafina, the guests were beginning to gather at the 17th century chapel. It had been lovingly restored, the old stone walls, glowing in the soft light, filtering through the stained glass windows. The pews were adorned with simple, elegant arrangements of white orchids and fragrant jasmine. A string quartet played softly in the background, the music, a gentle counterpoint to the sound of the waves outside. The guests were a small, intimate group: Sarah's family, Leo's parents and siblings, a few close friends from their respective lives. There were no celebrities, no business tycoons, no one there to see and be seen. They were there to celebrate a marriage, not a merger. Leo stood at the altar, his eyes fixed on the chapel doors. He was dressed in a simple, beautifully tailored linen suit, his usual quiet demeanor replaced with a look of pure, unadulterated joy. He wasn't the awkward, beige accountant of Mark's imagination. He was a man deeply in love, and his happiness was so palpable it seemed to light up the entire chapel. And then the doors opened. Sarah appeared, bathed in the soft afternoon light. She was on her father's arm, her smile radiant, her eyes locked on Leo's. As she walked down the aisle, a collective gasp went through the small congregation. She was, in a word, breathtaking. But it wasn't just the dress or the setting or the perfect light. It was the aura of peace and contentment that surrounded her. She was a woman who was exactly where she was meant to be, with the person she was meant to be with. The ceremony was short and deeply personal. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, their voices clear and steady, filled with love and promises of a shared future. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Leo didn't hesitate. He cupped Sarah's face in his hands and kissed her a long, tender kiss, that spoke of a love that was both a quiet sanctuary and a grand adventure. The brunch reception that followed was as planned an exquisite affair. The guests were seated at a long, beautifully decorated table on a terrace overlooking the ocean. The world-renowned chef had created a menu that was a celebration of local ingredients and flavors, each course a work of art. The wine from Leo's private cellar was rare and priceless, but the real luxury of the day was not the food or the wine or the stunning setting. It was the privacy. There were no photographers from glossy magazines, no reporters clamoring for a quote, no uninvited guests. Just the gentle hum of conversation, the sound of laughter, and the clinking of glasses as toasts were made to the happy couple. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the island, Leo and Sarah slipped away from their guests and walked hand in hand along the beach. The sand was soft and warm beneath their bare feet, the waves lapping gently at the shore. Happy Mrs. Sterling Leo asked his thumb, gently stroking the back of her hand. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. More than you could ever imagine, Mr. Sterling. She thought for a fleeting moment of Mark. She pictured him in his cold, sterile penthouse, surrounded by his expensive art and his beautiful, empty fiancée. She felt a pang, not of anger or resentment, or even pity, just a sense of distance. He was a chapter of her life that was now closed, a story that had reached its end. And her new story, the one she was writing with Leo, was just beginning. It was a story of quiet joy, of deep abiding love, and of a happiness so profound it needed no audience, no validation, no applause. It was a whisper on the wind, a secret shared between two hearts, and it was more beautiful than any shout could ever be. Mark's unease festered throughout the day, mutating into a full-blown obsession. The silence from Sarah's camp was a void he felt compelled to fill with his own narrative, but the lack of any new material was making it difficult. He was a man who dealt in facts, in data, in concrete evidence. The ambiguity of the situation was driving him to distraction. By late afternoon, his patience had worn thin. He couldn't stand it anymore. He had to know. He decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He drove to the part of town where St. Jude's Chapel was located. He told himself it was on the way to a hardware store, a flimsy excuse that even he didn't quite believe. As he pulled up to the chapel, a sneer formed on his face. It was even more pathetic than he remembered. The paint was peeling, a window was boarded up, and the small patch of grass out front was overgrown with weeds. The place looked deserted, abandoned. There were no cars, no lingering guests, no sign that a wedding had taken place just hours before. A for lease sign was staked in the ground, crooked and faded. He felt a confusing mix of triumph and disappointment. So the wedding had been so insignificant. It had left no trace, no echo. But where were the pictures, the smug posts, the evidence of her new lesser life? He was about to drive away when he noticed something. Tucked into the corner of the for lease sign was a small laminated card. He got out of his car, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the gravel. The card was a simple business card for a catering company, Seaside Suppers. Below the name in small print was an Instagram handle. A jolt of excitement went through him. A lead. He quickly pulled out his phone and searched for the handle. The page was public, a collection of professionally shot photos of beautiful food and elegant events. And there it was, posted just an hour ago. The photo was a masterpiece of composition and light. It was a close-up of a wedding cake, a stunning multi-tiered creation adorned with delicate handcrafted sugar flowers. It was the kind of cake that belonged in a magazine, not at a budget brunch. But it was the caption that made Mark's blood run cold. Congratulations to the happy couple. It was an honor to be a part of your magical day. What a privilege to work on the beautiful island of Serafina. Private island wedding, billionaire, wedding on Sterling New. Mark read the caption again and then a third time. The words seemed to swim before his eyes. Private island wedding. Billionaire wedding. He clicked on the hashtag Sterling New. The screen was flooded with a handful of images, all from the same exclusive event. The photos were breathtaking. A 17th century stone chapel glowing in the candlelight. A long, elegant table set for a feast on a terrace overlooking a turquoise sea. A stunning bride in a simple, impossibly chic lace gown, laughing with a handsome, smiling man. It was Sarah, but it was a Sarah he had never seen before. She was luminous, radiant, radiating a kind of quiet confidence that was more powerful than any overt display of wealth. And the man beside her, he was the mysterious Leo. He wasn't a bland accountant. He was handsome in a relaxed, understated way, and he looked at Sarah with an expression of such profound love and adoration that it made Mark's stomach clench. He frantically started searching for Leo Sterling again, but this time he added the word billionaire. The results were instantaneous and overwhelming. Leo Sterling, the reclusive genius behind the revolutionary AI firm Ethereum, a man who had sold his company for a staggering sum, a man who fiercely guarded his privacy, a man whose net worth was estimated to be in the billions, a man who owned a private island in the Caribbean named Serafina. Mark felt the world tilt on its axis. He stumbled back to his car, his mind reeling. The hand-drawn invitation, the koi chapel, the brunch reception. It had all been a lie, a deliberate, calculated deception. They had played him. They had made a fool of him. He thought of his smug comments, his derisive laughter, his public mockery. He had been so busy looking down on her, so convinced of his own superiority, that he had failed to see what was right in front of him. She hadn't been struggling. She had been soaring. He drove home in a daze, the city lights blurring into a meaningless smear. When he walked into his penthouse, Tiffany was there, preening in front of a mirror, trying on a new designer dress. "How do I look?" she asked, striking a pose. "Do you think this is too much for the charity gala on Friday?" Mark barely heard her. He was staring at the art on his walls, the expensive furniture, the panoramic view. It all suddenly felt cheap, gaudy. A desperate attempt to project an image of success that was in comparison to Leo Sterling's quiet, understated wealth, utterly pathetic. "Mark, are you listening to me?" Tiffany's voice was sharp, impatient. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in a long time. He saw the expensive dress, the flawless makeup, the perfectly coiffed hair. He saw a woman who was obsessed with surfaces, with appearances, with the trappings of wealth. He saw a reflection of himself, and he felt a wave of self-loathing so intense it almost made him gag. Later that night, the official photo was released. It was a single stunning shot of Sarah and Leo walking hand in hand on the beach at sunset. It was posted on the website of a prestigious philanthropic foundation that Leo had established. The caption was simple: "Introducing Mr. and Mrs. Sterling." In lieu of gifts, the couple requests that donations be made to the foundation's new initiative for marine conservation. The story went viral. It was picked up by news outlets, by financial journals, by celebrity gossip blogs. The narrative was irresistible. The quiet, unassuming tech billionaire marrying his beautiful, talented artist wife in a secret, ultra-exclusive ceremony. It was a modern-day fairy tale. And in every story, there was a villain, a minor character, a footnote. The bitter ex-husband who had publicly mocked his former wife only to have her marry a man 1,000 times more successful and 1,000,000 times more respected than he would ever be. His name, Mark Copeland, was mentioned in a few of the articles, his snide social media comments screenshotted for the world to see. He was no longer the winner. He was a punchline. The man who had mocked his ex-wife's budget wedding while she quietly married a billionaire on his private island. The irony was so thick, so suffocating, he felt like he was drowning in it. The unraveling had begun. The story of Sarah and Leo Sterling's wedding did not just break, it detonated in the hyper-connected world of instant news and viral narratives. It was the perfect storm of romance, intrigue, and schadenfreude. It wasn't relegated to the society pages. It was a lead story on financial news sites, tech blogs, and mainstream media outlets. The headlines were mercilessly captivating. From divorced to Duchess, the artist who captured a reclusive billionaire's heart. The quietest wedding, the loudest statement. And woven into every telling of this modern fairy tale was the dark cautionary thread of the bitter ex-husband. Mark Copeland's smug, condescending social media comment was screenshotted and plastered everywhere, a digital artifact of his own hubris. Online forums dissected it with glee. Anonymous commenters became a Greek chorus narrating his downfall. He mocked her cozy chapel. One popular comment read, while she was getting married in a 17th century one on a private island, "You can't write this stuff." Another said, "This is what happens when you think a big bank account is a substitute for a personality." Mark was no longer a name associated with corporate raiding and success. He was a meme, a punchline, a case study in petty cruelty, backfiring in the most spectacular way imaginable. The fallout in his professional life was a slow-motion demolition. He walked into his office the following Monday to an atmosphere thick with a new cloying deference. His employees spoke to him in hushed tones, their eyes darting away, filled not with the fear and respect he had once commanded, but with a humiliating mixture of pity and contempt. They had all seen the articles. They had all seen him exposed as a fool. The critical blow came during the final negotiations for the hostile takeover he had been orchestrating for months. It was his signature move, the kind of aggressive, high-stakes play that had built his reputation. He strode into the boardroom, attempting to project an aura of unshakable confidence, but he knew his armor was cracked. Across the polished table, the CEO of the target company, a man named Peterson, whom Mark had privately derided as weak, looked at him with a calm, predatory smile. "Mark," Peterson began, leaning back in his chair, "we've reviewed your final offer, and we're going to have to decline." "That's a mistake, and you know it," Mark blustered, falling back on old habits. "My offer is more than generous." Peterson's smile widened. "Oh, I don't know. Generosity seems to be a complex concept for you, doesn't it? We've been reading all about it." He gestured vaguely, as if to encompass the entire internet. "My board has concerns about a merger. It's a matter of brand alignment. We cultivate an image of integrity, of forward-thinking vision. Your recent public exposure suggests a certain lack of judgment, a focus on the superficial, perhaps." The room was silent. Mark could feel the eyes of his own team on him, could feel their collective cringe. Peterson had turned his own public humiliation into a weapon and was now gutting him with it in front of his own people. The deal wasn't just dead, it was being buried in a coffin of Mark's own making. The collapse cost his company a fortune in sunk legal fees and market speculation, but the damage to his reputation was incalculable. He was no longer seen as a shark. He was seen as a joke who had been outmaneuvered by his ex-wife's happiness. His social life disintegrated with equal swiftness. The friends who had populated his group chat with laughing emojis now treated him like a contagion. He called his supposed best friend, a man named Garrett, who had been the chief architect of many of the jokes at Sarah's expense. Garrett, who had vacationed on Mark's yacht and drunk his vintage wine, was suddenly brisk and distant. "Garrett, it's Mark." "Hey, Mark. Listen, I'm just about to step into a meeting. Can I call you back?" The lie was so thin it was transparent. "I just wanted to see if you and Jessica were free for dinner Friday." "Ah, Friday's no good. Packed solid," Garrett cut in. "Listen, man, things are just crazy right now. I'll buzz you." He never did. The invitations stopped coming. The calls went unanswered. He was unceremoniously dropped from the charity boards and exclusive clubs that had once been the cornerstones of his social standing. His value had been tied to his power and his image as an untouchable winner. Now that the image was shattered, he had no value. The final, most devastating blow was delivered in the cold marble expanse of his own penthouse. He came home one evening to find Tiffany's Louis Vuitton suitcases lined up by the door like soldiers in a funeral procession. She was in the walk-in closet, methodically removing her designer dresses from their hangers, her movements sharp and efficient. "What's this?" he asked, his voice hollow, already knowing the answer. She didn't turn to look at him. "It's called leaving Mark. I suggest you Google it." Her voice was brittle, stripped of all its practiced sweetness. "Tiff, don't be ridiculous," he pleaded, a wave of panic rising in his chest. "Because of some stupid articles. We're stronger than that." She finally spun around her face, a mask of cold fury. In her hand, she held a silk Fendi dress. This is what we are." "Mark," she said, shaking the dress at him. "This dress, that ridiculous sculpture in the hall you bought because it was an important piece. The plans for that obscene wedding in Tuscany that was going to be nothing more than a vulgar performance for a crowd of people we don't even like. We aren't a couple. We're a brand, and your brand is toxic." She walked past him into the living room, her heels clicking like tiny hammers on the marble floor. "I spent the last 2 days being pitied. Do you have any idea how that feels? Women who used to be jealous of me are now looking at me with pity. They're wondering what kind of fool I must be to be engaged to a man who is not only cruel, but stupid. A man who was so blinded by his own ego, he couldn't see that his mousy ex-wife was quietly marrying into one of the most respected fortunes on the planet. I gave you everything," he yelled, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You gave me accessories," she shot back, her voice rising. "You didn't give me love or respect or a partnership. You gave me a ring to show off and a life that looked good on Instagram. Well, it doesn't look so good anymore. Sarah's wedding, as you so eloquently put it, wasn't budget. It was priceless. It was private and elegant and real. All the things we'll never be." She picked up her purse from the counter. Her massive engagement ring caught the light, and for the first time it looked grotesque to him, a gaudy bauble of a life that had been a complete illusion. "Goodbye, Mark," she said, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "I hope you and your penthouse will be very happy together. It's a shame it can't keep you warm at night." The click of the door closing behind her was the sound of his world ending. He was left in the echoing silence, a king in a cold, empty museum dedicated to his own failure. He sank onto a white leather sofa that had cost more than a car and felt nothing. He was utterly, completely alone. The city lights twinkled outside, no longer a kingdom at his feet, but a million indifferent stars in a universe that didn't care he existed. He had lost everything, not because of a bad business deal or a market crash, but because he had been a cruel man. And the universe, it seemed, had a long and poetic memory. A year bled into the next, each day a grey, monotonous echo of the one before for Mark Copeland. The world, with its voracious appetite for scandal and its fleeting attention span, had largely forgotten his name. His public humiliation had been a brief, bright fire, quickly extinguished to make way for the next spectacle. But for Mark, the embers of that fire still glowed, a constant, searing heat beneath the surface of his life. He lived inside a prison of his own, making the bars forged from regret, and the lock a key of profound, irreversible loss. His empire, once a testament to his aggressive genius, had crumbled into a modest, struggling enterprise. He had been forced to sell Copeland Acquisitions, his name now a liability he couldn't afford. He retained a small consulting firm operating out of a cramped, soulless office in a building that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. The floor-to-ceiling windows, with their panoramic city views, were gone, replaced by a single grimy window that looked out onto a brick wall. His days were spent chasing minor clients and wrestling with spreadsheets that bled red ink, a constant, humiliating reminder of his fall. The penthouse, that gleaming monument to his arrogance, had been the first thing to go. He now lived in a sterile one-bedroom apartment in a faceless high-rise furnished with generic pieces that held no history and offered no comfort. He often ate cheap takeout standing over the sink, the silence of the apartment a roaring chasm. He'd tried calling his old friends the pack of jackals who had laughed with him at Sarah's expense. The calls went to voicemail. His invitations were met with flimsy, transparent excuses. He was radioactive, a pariah, in the very circles he had once dominated. He was no longer a winner, and in their world, there was no currency more worthless than a loser. His nights were the worst. Sleep offered little escape, often bringing nightmares, where he was falling from a great height. More often, he'd stay awake, fueled by expensive scotch that no longer tasted of success, but only of bitterness. In the blue glow of his laptop screen, he would become a digital ghost, haunting the periphery of Sarah's new life. He'd scroll through the website of the Sterling Foundation, a name that was now synonymous with impactful, intelligent philanthropy. He saw Sarah and Leo not in the glossy, superficial pages of celebrity magazines, but in photos from National Geographic or the UN Chronicle. There, they were breaking ground on a state-of-the-art marine biology research center on the coast of Costa Rica, an extension of their passion for ocean conservation. He saw Sarah, her face glowing with purpose, demonstrating a new water purification system to women in a remote village in Southeast Asia. He saw a feature in Forbes, not about her husband's wealth, but about her. It detailed the astonishing success of her ethical ceramics brand, Terra Firma, which had partnered with the MoMA design store in New York. The article praised her business acumen and her commitment to fair trade practices, celebrating her as a new model of entrepreneur, successful, soulful, and socially conscious. Every photo, every article was a fresh twist of the knife. It wasn't the wealth that tormented him, it was the meaning. They weren't just spending money, they were building a legacy. They were creating healing and contributing. Their life was a rich, intricate tapestry of purpose, while his was a single frayed thread, worn thin by resentment. He had accused her of having simple hobbies, but those hobbies had blossomed into a life of extraordinary substance. He, the master of the deal, the king of the material world, had built a life that was utterly spiritually bankrupt. The inevitable final confrontation came on a crisp, golden afternoon in October. Mark was in New York, a last-ditch effort to court an investor who he suspected was only meeting him out of morbid curiosity. The meeting had been a disaster, a thinly veiled exercise in condescension. Defeated Mark walked aimlessly through the West Village, the vibrant energy of the city, a stark contrast to the hollowness within him. And then he saw her. She was coming out of a small independent bookstore, a canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder. Leo was with her, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. They were laughing, a deep, easy sound that blended with the city's hum. Sarah tilted her head back, her face alight with a joy so pure and unself-conscious it struck Mark with the force of a physical blow. She looked younger, more vibrant, and more beautiful than he had ever remembered. The city, with all its noise and chaos, seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of shared contentment. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to turn, to melt into the crowd, to flee. But his feet were rooted to the pavement. A toxic cocktail of emotions swirled within him: shame, envy, a desperate, pathetic longing. He needed something from her, though he couldn't name what it was. Forgiveness, acknowledgement. Perhaps he just wanted to see a flicker of pain in her eyes, a sign that he had once mattered, that his ghost still haunted her, even a little. Taking a shaky breath, he stepped forward, his voice a hoarse crack. Sarah. They both stopped and turned. Sarah's smile faded, replaced by a look of mild, distant surprise, the kind one might give to a half-forgotten acquaintance. Leo's expression remained placid, but his posture shifted subtly, a quiet shield placing himself slightly between Mark and Sarah. His eyes, calm and intelligent, assessed Mark not as a threat, but as a curiosity. Mark's carefully rehearsed speeches, the ones he'd delivered to his reflection in the dead of night, evaporated. He was left fumbling exposed. Mark, Sarah said. It wasn't a question, but a simple statement of fact. Her voice was the same, yet entirely different. It lacked the old undertones of deference, the faint tremor of a woman accustomed to being interrupted. It was clear, steady, and calm. I saw your article in Forbes. He began the words, sounding clumsy and foolish as soon as they left his lips. Congratulations. Your pottery is everywhere. Thank you, she said politely, the way one thanks a stranger who holds a door open. There was no warmth, no opening for further conversation. The silence stretched thick with everything unsaid. Desperation clawed at him. Listen, Sarah. I know it's a year too late, a lifetime too late, probably, but I had to say it. I'm sorry. The words tumbled out in a rush. For everything, for how I was, for the things I said about your wedding, about you. It was cruel, unforgivable. I was an idiot. He searched her face for a reaction for anything, a flash of anger, a glint of triumph, even a flicker of pity. He found nothing. She looked at him with a profound and devastating neutrality. It was the look of a person gazing at a landscape from a former life, a place they no longer inhabited and felt no connection to. Her indifference was not a weapon. It was a fact. It was the final, irrefutable proof that he had been completely and utterly excised from her heart. She drew a slow breath, her gaze unwavering. My happiness. Mark was never about proving you wrong, she said, her voice gentle but firm, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. And my life now, it isn't a reaction to the life I had with you. It's just my life. It has nothing to do with you anymore. She paused, and in that moment, he finally understood. Her victory wasn't marrying a billionaire. Her victory was this moment, this unbreachable peace. Her victory was that her emotional well-being was no longer tied to him in any way. I hope you find what you're looking for, Mark, she said, and it was the final, gentle blow. It wasn't a wish for his happiness, not really. It was a dismissal, a final closing of a book that she had finished reading long ago. She gave Leo's arm a soft squeeze, a silent communication that passed between them. He smiled down at her, a look of such tenderness and profound understanding that it made Mark's insides clench with a jealousy so fierce it tasted like acid. Without another glance in his direction, they turned and continued down the street, their shared laughter soon swallowed by the sounds of the city. Mark stood frozen on the sidewalk, a solitary statue in the river of humanity that flowed around him. He watched them go, two people perfectly in sync, moving toward a future he couldn't even imagine. He had mocked her small world, and in doing so had revealed the pathetic smallness of his own. His universe, once seemingly infinite and filled with expensive glittering things, had collapsed into a black hole of one himself. Sarah hadn't needed revenge. She had simply outgrown him. She had walked away from the noise of his ego and into a symphony of a life one filled with quiet purpose, genuine love and resonant joy. And he was left standing in the silence with nothing but the haunting echo of his own bitter, foolish laughter. Thank you for watching this story of poetic justice and quiet triumph. Sarah's journey is a powerful reminder that the best revenge is not loud or flashy, but a life well lived. While Mark was trapped in his own echo chamber of bitterness and arrogance, Sarah quietly built a world of genuine happiness, love, and purpose. Her story shows us that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or flashy possessions, but in peace of mind, self-respect, and the love we give and receive. What did you think of Mark's downfall? Was it karma, or did he get what he deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of real-life drama and satisfying twists, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a good story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for new videos every week. Your support helps us to keep bringing you these compelling narratives. Thanks for listening.
In the glittering world of New York's elite appearances are everything. Tonight at the Starlight Foundation. Gala. The most powerful people in the country have gathered draped in diamonds and ambition. But a single girl threatens to shatter their perfect illusion. She walks in alone, wearing a simple, borrowed dress, an outcast in her own world. They whisper and sneer, believing she's nothing, the forgotten daughter of a fallen titan. They are about to learn a lesson they will never forget. Because in a world built on lies, the one thing more powerful than a scandalous secret is the man who holds the truth. The air on the 80th floor of the Olympian Tower was different. It was thinner, carrying the scent of money, Chanel No. 5, and a sterile floral arrangement that was replaced every 48 hours. For Annalise Beaumont, however, it smelled only of confinement. From her small room, once designated for a junior maid, she could see the entirety of Central Park unfurl like a green carpet, a world away from her gilded soul. Tonight was the Starlight Foundation Gala. The undisputed pinnacle of New York City's social calendar. It was an evening where fortunes were pledged, alliances were forged, and reputations were made or mercilessly broken under the flash of paparazzi bulbs and the weight of judgmental stares. For her stepmother, Genevieve Dubois Beaumont, it was the Super Bowl. For her stepsister, Madeline, it was a coronation. For Annalise, it was supposed to be nothing. "You can't possibly be serious," Genevieve had scoffed earlier that day, her voice a low, dangerous purr. She stood framed in the doorway of Annalise's room, a vision in a silk dressing gown, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against the doorframe. "You at the gala? Don't be absurd." Annalise clutched the simple navy blue dress hanging on the back of her door. It was her mother's, a classic Dior from a decade ago, elegant in its understated simplicity. It was the only thing of value she had left of her. "Father's company is still a primary sponsor," Annalise replied, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "There's an invitation for a family representative. I am family." Genevieve's laugh was like the crack of ice. "You are a relic, darling. A footnote in the Beaumont story. Your father, Robert, hasn't been seen in public for 3 years. In this city, that means he doesn't exist. I am the face of Beaumont Innovations now. Madeline is its future. You are an unfortunate obligation." The words were meant to sting, and they did. Her father, Robert Beaumont, was a legend, a titan of the tech industry who had built an empire from a garage, a man whose vision had changed the world. But 3 years ago, he had simply vanished. The official story, spun with Genevieve's signature grace, was that he had stepped back for a life of private reflection, exhausted from his years of relentless innovation. He was, she often told the glossy pages of Vanity Fair, on a permanent spiritual retreat in an undisclosed location, communicating only through her. Annalise knew it was a lie. The few times she'd asked to speak to him, Genevieve had produced curt, impersonal emails, supposedly from him, stating he was disappointed in Annalise's lack of ambition and wished to be left alone. He hadn't called not even for her birthday. The warmth of her father, the man who taught her to code on his lap and called her his little spark, had been replaced by a cold digital silence. Her stepsister Madeline appeared behind Genevieve, already glowing from a day of spa treatments. She leaned against the door, examining her nails with a bored expression. Honestly, Annalise, what would you even wear? Your entire wardrobe looks like it came from a consignment shop. Oh, wait, she said, feigning realization. It probably did. Annalise's jaw tightened. Her trust fund established by her mother had been systematically drained by management fees and household expenses that Genevieve controlled. She was given a meager allowance enough to attend her classes at Columbia University, and little else, a deliberate tactic to keep her dependent and powerless. I have a dress, Annalise said quietly. Let me guess, Madeline sneered. The dusty old thing your mother wore. How sentimental and pathetic. No one at the gala wants to see a ghost from the past. They want to see the future. She gestured to herself, a smug smile playing on her lips. Her own gown for the evening, a custom Oscar de la Renta, shimmering with hand-sewn crystals, had cost more than Annalise's entire annual tuition. Genevieve delivered the final blow. You will not embarrass this family, Annalise. You are not to attend. The driver is taking me and Madeline at 7. The security staff at the Met have been given a list. Your name is not on it. She swept away Madeline in her wake, leaving Annalise in the suffocating silence of her tiny room. Humiliation burned hot in her chest. For years she had endured it. The whispers, the exclusion, the slow, methodical erasure of her existence within her own home. They had taken her father her inheritance and her confidence. But tonight, something inside her snapped. It was a quiet, desperate rebellion, a need to prove, if only to herself, that she still existed. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above her dresser. She saw a pale, serious girl with her father's deep brown eyes. They were eyes that used to sparkle with curiosity and joy. Tonight, they held a flicker of defiance. Genevieve was a master of control, but she had made one mistake. She had forgotten that Annalise Beaumont was her father's daughter, and Robert Beaumont had never, ever backed down from a fight. Annalise had her own invitation. As a student liaison for a university arts program that Beaumont Innovations sponsored, a single non-transferable ticket had been sent to her university email address. Genevieve didn't know it existed. Her plan was simple and terrifying. She would take the subway. She would walk up the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art alone, and she would face the lions in their den. She didn't know what she hoped to achieve. Perhaps just to stand in the same room as them, to breathe the same air, and to not be invisible for one night. She smoothed the silk of her mother's dress, a silent prayer on her lips. It felt like armor. Tonight she wouldn't be a relic. She would be a Beaumont. The New York City subway was a world away from the chauffeured silence of a Bentley. It was a roaring, chaotic symphony of life, a stark contrast to the sterile elegance of the Olympian Tower. Annalise, holding onto a pole as the train rattled downtown, felt a strange sense of freedom in the anonymity of the crowd. Here she was, just another girl in a nice dress, not the ghost of the Beaumont penthouse. When she emerged at 86th Street, the evening air was cool and crisp. The sounds of the city were muffled by a reverent hush that always seemed to descend around the grand institutions of Museum Mile. Ahead, the Metropolitan Museum of Art was lit up like a beacon, its iconic steps a cascade of light and motion. A river of black cars flowed towards it, depositing men in sharp tuxedos and women in gowns that shimmered like jewels. Annalise's heart pounded against her ribs. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn back, to retreat to the safety of her small room. But the memory of Genevieve's cruel laugh and Madeleine's dismissive sneer propelled her forward. She tightened her grip on her small clutch and began her ascent. The press line was a frenzy of flashing lights and shouted names. "Madeleine over here, who are you wearing?" The cameras flashed blindingly as her stepsister posed a vision of entitlement in her crystal-encrusted gown. Genevieve was beside her, radiating regal confidence, accepting praise for her tireless charity work. They looked like a queen, and her princess the undisputed rulers of this glittering kingdom. Annalise slipped past the main entrance, heading for the side check-in for individual ticket holders. Her heart a frantic drum. She presented her ticket, a simple QR code on her phone, to a stern-looking woman with a headset. The woman scanned it, her eyes flicking from the screen to Annalise, a flicker of surprise in her expression. "Beaumont," she murmured before nodding. "Go ahead, miss." She had made it inside. The great hall was even more breathtaking than she remembered, transformed into an enchanted forest of shimmering lights and towering floral arrangements. The air buzzed with conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. But as she stepped into the throng, a wave of cold realization washed over her. She was utterly and completely alone. The whispers started almost immediately. A woman with a diamond necklace that could fund a small country leaned towards her companion. "Is that Robert Beaumont's girl?" "The first one." Her friend squinted. "I thought she was shipped off to a boarding school in Switzerland. Good heavens, look at her dress. It's practically a museum piece." They both shared a thinly veiled, cruel titter. Annalise kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on a distant tapestry as she walked, pretending she hadn't heard. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. Her mother's simple, elegant dress, which had felt like armor in her room, now felt like a pauper's rags. She saw Madeleine holding court near the grand staircase, surrounded by a coterie of equally beautiful and vapid young socialites. Their gazes fell upon Annalise, and a collective sourire spread across their faces. Madeleine detached herself from the group and glided towards Annalise, her expression a perfect mask of feigned concern. "Annalise, I can't believe it. How did you even get in?" Madeleine's voice was sweet, but her eyes were chips of ice. "I was invited," Annalise said, her own voice barely a whisper. "Oh, a charity ticket." "How quaint," Madeleine said, loud enough for those around them to hear. "Well, do try not to embarrass yourself. The catering staff is using the service entrance if you get lost." She patted Annalise's arm in a condescending gesture of pity before turning her back and walking away, the laughter of her friends following her like a poisoned dart. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from her neck to her cheeks. She wanted to disappear. She backed away from the crowd, finding refuge in a quieter alcove near a Grecian statue. She watched the party from the periphery, an invisible ghost haunting the edges of a life that should have been hers. "They're a nasty piece of work, aren't they?" Annalise jumped, startled. A young man was standing beside her, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He had kind eyes and a slightly crooked smile. He was handsome, but not in the polished, predatory way of the other men in the room. He was Nicholas Chandler, a journalist for a well-respected financial journal, known for his incisive, no-nonsense reporting. "I'm sorry," Annalise stammered. "The Dubois girls, or Beaumont, I guess one of them is now," he clarified, nodding towards Madeleine and her clique. "I've been covering this social circuit for years. You learn to spot the sharks. He offered her a glass. "You look like you could use this." Annalise hesitated, then accepted it. "Thank you." "Nicholas Chandler," he said, extending a hand. "Annalise Beaumont." His eyebrows shot up in recognition. "Beaumont. The Beaumont." He looked at her with genuine curiosity, not pity or scorn. Well, everyone has wondered. About your father, about you. The story Genevieve spins has always felt a little too neat." For the first time all evening, Annalise didn't feel like a pariah. She felt seen. "The neat stories are usually the ones with the most pages torn out," she said, surprising herself with her own candor. A genuine smile broke across his face. "I have a feeling you have quite a story to tell, Annalise Beaumont." He was about to say more when a sudden palpable change swept through the great hall. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the opposite. It was a sudden absence of it. The cacophony of chatter and laughter died down, replaced by a wave of hushed whispers that grew into a stunned silence. Every head in the room, as if pulled by an invisible string, turned towards the grand entrance. The sea of couture-clad bodies parted. Annalise followed their gaze, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips. And then she saw him. Her heart stopped. It was impossible. But it was him. Standing in the magnificent archway framed by the light was her father, Robert Beaumont. He looked older, thinner, and he leaned heavily on a simple wooden cane. But his eyes, those same deep brown eyes she saw in her own reflection, were blazing with a fire she hadn't seen in years. He wasn't looking at the shocked faces of New York's elite. He was looking straight at her. And as the city's most powerful people stared in utter disbelief one by one, out of a respect that transcended gossip and time, they began to stand. The silence in the great hall was a living thing. It was heavier than the marble of the statues, more valuable than the diamonds on display. For 3 years, Robert Beaumont had been a ghost, a myth whispered about at dinner parties and speculated upon in financial columns. Now the myth was made flesh, and the shock was so profound it felt like a physical force pressing the air from the room. He stood there for a long moment, his presence dominating the cavernous space more than any orchestra or grand announcement ever could. He wasn't the robust, energetic titan they remembered. The sharp lines of his custom suit hung slightly loose on his frame, and the hand gripping his cane was tight, showing white knuckles. But his gaze was unwavering, an intense, focused beam that cut through the glittering crowd and found its target, Annalise. Annalise was frozen in her alcove, the champagne glass slipping from her nerveless fingers to shatter silently on the thick rug. It couldn't be him. It was a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and longing. Yet he didn't vanish. He took a deliberate, difficult step forward, the soft thud of his cane on the marble floor echoing in the unnatural quiet. The crowd did not part for him out of courtesy. It recoiled, stepping back as if a king had returned to find his court in disarray. Every eye was on him, but his were only for his daughter. Across the room, Genevieve's perfectly composed face had shattered. Her mouth was slightly agape, the color draining from her cheeks, leaving behind a ghastly white mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Madeleine, for the first time in her life, looked utterly lost, her smug confidence evaporating into thin air. She stared at the man she called her stepfather, as if he were an apparition. Robert's eyes, when they met Annalise's, were a storm of emotions she couldn't begin to decipher. Pain, regret, and a fierce, protective love that felt like a physical warmth spreading through her chilled body. He saw her standing alone in her mother's simple dress with the shattered glass at her feet, and in his gaze she saw the father she had lost. He started walking towards her. It was a slow, arduous journey across the vast hall. Each step seemed to cost him, but his resolve was iron. The crowd watched, mesmerized. This was not just a man walking. It was a legend coming back to life, and no one dared to speak, to move, to even breathe too loudly. As he drew closer, Annalise could see the fine lines of strain around his eyes, the silver that now threaded through his dark hair. The last 3 years had taken a toll, a far greater one than any spiritual retreat ever could. Genevieve finally broke from her stupor. She rushed forward, her voice a high-pitched, frantic whisper. "Robert! My God! Robert, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here." She tried to take his arm, to steer him away, to regain control of the narrative. He didn't even look at her. He brushed her hand away with a cold finality that was more damning than any shout. "Don't touch me, Genevieve," he said, his voice raspy from disuse, but clear and resonant in the silence. He stopped directly in front of Annalise. He reached out a slightly trembling hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch was real. This was real. Tears welled in Annalise's eyes, blurring his face. "My little spark," he whispered the old nickname, a key turning a lock in her heart. "What have they done to you?" Before Annalise could answer, Genevieve was there again, her voice laced with desperation. "Robert, darling, let's go. This isn't the place. You're confused." She shot a venomous glare at Annalise. "She has been filling your head with lies. I have cared for you. Protected you. Protected me." Robert's voice rose, no longer a rasp, but a roar that echoed off the high ceilings. He turned to face his wife, and for the first time, everyone on the full force of his fury. "You call this protection? You locked me away in my own home. You isolated me from my own child. You told me she wanted nothing to do with me while you told her I had abandoned her." Gasps rippled through the crowd. This was better than gossip. This was the public immolation of a queen. Nicholas Chandler, standing near Annalise, had his phone out, discreetly recording. He wasn't a gossip columnist, but he knew he was witnessing the implosion of an empire. Robert turned his fiery gaze back to the crowd, his voice ringing with authority. "For 3 years I have been a prisoner, not in some ashram in the Himalayas, but on the top floor of the Olympian Tower. A prisoner of a stroke, and a prisoner of this woman's greed." He pointed a trembling finger at Genevieve. "She controlled every email, every call, every visitor. She told the world I was finding peace while she was systematically dismantling my life's work. And worse, she tried to destroy the one thing I have left in this world that truly matters." He looked back at Annalise, his expression softening into one of profound sorrow. "I am sorry, Annalise. I am so sorry. I failed you. But I am not gone yet." He took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. He turned to face the hundreds of stunned onlookers, the titans of finance, the doyens of society, the chroniclers of their world. He held his daughter's hand up as if it were a trophy. "This," he announced, his voice booming with renewed power, "is Annalise Beaumont, my daughter, my heir, the true heart of Beaumont Innovations. And anyone who has a problem with that," he said, his eyes finding and locking with Genevieve's, "has a problem with me." The silence finally broke, not with applause, but with a tidal wave of frantic whispers. Cameras flashed, capturing Genevieve's horrified face, Madeline's stunned disbelief, and the quiet, tearful dignity of the girl in the simple blue dress, no longer alone, standing beside the father who had come back from the dead to reclaim her. The gala was forgotten. The real story had just begun. The drive from the museum was a blur. Robert Beaumont, with a quiet authority that had silenced all opposition, had a trusted security detail, men who had been with him for decades and had been rehired that very day, escort them from the gala. They didn't go back to the Olympia Noire. Instead, the car wound its way through the hushed streets of the Upper East Side to the stately elegance of the Plaza Hotel. A suite had already been prepared, a sanctuary far from Genevieve's surveillance. Inside, overlooking the dark expanse of Central Park, the adrenaline of the public confrontation began to fade, leaving behind a heavy silence filled with 3 years of unspoken words. Robert sank into an armchair, the effort of the evening clearly visible on his face. He looked frail, yet his eyes, fixed on Annalise, were sharp and lucid. "They told me you were at a special program in Grenoble," he began, his voice soft. "Thriving. You had requested space to grow without my shadow. The emails, they seemed like you. A little cold, maybe, but I thought you were just growing up, becoming your own person." Annalise sat on the edge of a sofa opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "She told me you were disappointed in me, that I wasn't ambitious enough, that I reminded you too much of Mom, and the grief was too hard. She said you needed to be away from everything that connected you to the past. The emails I got were so formal. Dear Annalise, I trust your studies are progressing. Regards, Father." "I thought you hated me." A single tear traced a path down Robert's weary cheek. "Oh, my spark. Never. Not for a second." He began to tell her the story of the last 3 years, and it was a tale far more sinister than Annalise could have imagined. It hadn't started with a sudden massive stroke. It began with smaller things, a period of intense stress at work, followed by what the doctors hired by Genevieve had called transient ischemic attacks, mini-strokes. They caused confusion, memory lapses, and fatigue. Genevieve had used this as her opening. "She insisted I step back from the company," Robert explained. "She said it was for my own good, to prevent a major health event. She brought in her own medical staff, a private nurse, a therapist. They kept me sedated for the anxiety, they said. My own physician, Dr. Peterson, was told I'd retained a new private care team, and his services were no longer needed. My longtime assistant, Martha, was fired for breaching my privacy. He had become a ghost in his own home, confined to the master suite. Genevieve became his gatekeeper, his only link to the outside world. She would read him his emails, summarizing them with her own poisonous spin. She would tell him of Annalise's supposed resentment, showing him fabricated emails where his daughter asked for more money, but less contact. To Annalise, she painted the picture of a cold, distant father who had willingly walked away. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The major stroke happened about 18 months ago. Robert continued, his voice dropping. It was bad. For weeks I couldn't move my right side. My world became that bed, those 4 walls. Genevieve was in complete control. She told the board I had appointed her my proxy in all business matters. She told you I had entered a silent meditation retreat. Recovery was a slow, painful, and secret battle. A young physical therapist, a recent hire who didn't know the whole story, was the first crack in Genevieve's fortress. He saw the intelligence in Robert's eyes, the frustration, the fight. He saw that Robert wasn't a man who wanted peace and quiet. He was a caged lion. His name was Leo, Robert said. He started smuggling me a tablet, just for a few minutes each day. I couldn't type well with my left hand, but it was enough. I started digging. I saw the company's stock reports, the strange executive appointments, the sell-off of subsidiary assets. And then I searched for you. He hadn't found a thriving student in Grenoble. He found her Columbia University student profile, her modest arts blog, a photo of her volunteering at a soup kitchen. He saw the girl he knew, the one with a good heart, living a small, quiet life just a few miles away. The lie was so audacious, so complete, it stole his breath. That was the moment the fog truly lifted. He said, his voice thick with emotion. The anger gave me a strength I didn't know I had left. Leo helped me get in touch with Frank Connolly, my old head of security, the one Genevieve had forced into early retirement. We've been planning this for 2 months, getting my strength back, contacting my lawyers, waiting for the right moment to strike. Annalise listened, her mind reeling. It wasn't neglect. It wasn't disappointment. It was a hijacking. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had been stolen from her. The years of quiet heartache, of feeling utterly alone and unloved, coalesced into a single burning point of anger directed at Genevieve. "Why the gala?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because she loves nothing more than an audience," Robert answered, a grim look on his face. To be exposed in a quiet boardroom would be one thing. To be annihilated in front of the entire world she worships, that is justice. I knew she and Madeline would be there. I didn't know you would be. When Frank told me you had just walked in alone, I knew tonight was the night. I couldn't let you face them alone for one more second. He reached across the space between them, and Annalise took his hand. It was the same hand that had taught her to ride a bike, that had wiped away her tears when she was small. It was weaker now, but it was still her father's. "I have been so alone," she whispered. "Never again." He vowed, his grip tightening. "I promise you, Annalise, never again. This is just the beginning." She didn't just try to steal our family. She tried to steal my company. And tomorrow morning, she's going to find out what happens when you try to steal from a Beaumont. The first light of dawn cast long shadows across the hotel suite. Annalise hadn't slept. She had spent the night talking with her father, piecing together the broken fragments of the last 3 years. It was a painful, cathartic process, like setting a bone that had healed incorrectly. At precisely 7:00 a.m., there was a sharp knock on the door. It wasn't room service. It was David Chen, Robert Beaumont's personal lawyer. For over 30 years, a man whose loyalty was as legendary as his sharp legal mind. He was followed by Frank Connolly, the burly ex-head of security. They carried briefcases that seemed to hum with the gravity of their contents. "Robert?" David said, his voice a calm counterpoint to the storm that was brewing. "It's worse than we thought." He opened his briefcase on the large mahogany dining table, spreading out a series of documents, spreadsheets, and banking statements. It was the architecture of a grand betrayal. "Genevieve wasn't just isolating you and mismanaging the company," David explained, his finger tracing a line of interconnected shell corporations. "This was a coordinated, systematic plundering. She was working with her brother, a man named Luc Dubois, a disgraced investment banker from Paris." The name hit Annalise. She remembered Luc, a slick, charming man who visited occasionally, always flattering Genevieve and looking at the Beaumont wealth with hungry eyes. David continued, "While you were incapacitated, Genevieve used her proxy vote to install her brother on the board of a newly created wholly owned subsidiary of Beaumont Innovations, Beaumont Global Ventures. It was supposed to handle overseas investments. In reality, it was their personal piggy bank. He pointed to a series of wire transfers. Millions of dollars had been funneled from Beaumont Innovations to Beaumont Global Ventures for research and development projects in Europe. These projects were phantoms. From there, the money was laundered through a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, controlled by Luke. She was bleeding this company dry from the inside. Robert murmured, his face ashen. The quarterly reports I was shown, they were all doctored. Completely, David confirmed. She had a for-profit accounting firm on her payroll to create 2 sets of books, one for you and the board, and one for reality. But it gets worse. She wasn't just stealing the cash flow. She was after the crown jewels. He produced another document, a preliminary sales agreement. This is a letter of intent to sell a 40% controlling stake in Beaumont Innovations' proprietary AI patent portfolio to a competitor, a rival tech conglomerate named Omnicorp. The deal was set to close in 2 weeks. It would have effectively gutted the company, leaving it a hollow shell. Omnicorp would gain control of your life's work, and Genevieve and her brother would walk away with a 9-figure payout wired directly offshore. The audacity of it was breathtaking. She hadn't just been trying to live off his fortune. She had been trying to liquidate his entire legacy. The stroke, Robert said, a look of dawning horror on his face. The day before my first major attack, I had found an irregularity, a wire transfer to a bank I didn't recognize. I confronted her. She told me it was a clerical error, that she would handle it. She seemed so panicked. The next morning, I collapsed. Annalise felt a chill run down her spine. You don't think... David Chen exchanged a dark look with Frank Connolly. We can't prove it, not yet, the lawyer said carefully. But the timing is grotesquely convenient. She saw you were getting close, and suddenly your health took a turn for the worse, putting you under the care of medical staff that she hand-picked and controlled. Frank, the security chief, finally spoke up, his voice a low grumble. We've been looking into that private nurse, the main one. Turns out she has a history. 2 other wealthy elderly patients who died suddenly, leaving their fortunes to surprisingly new confidants. Nothing was ever proven, but the pattern is there. We've handed our findings over to the district attorney's office this morning. The room fell silent. This was no longer just a story of family drama and greed. It had spiraled into a dark conspiracy of corporate espionage, massive fraud, and potentially attempted murder. Genevieve wasn't just a cruel stepmother. She was a ruthless predator. She underestimated me, Robert said, a cold fury hardening his voice. She saw a sick old man. She forgot that I built my company by seeing 10 moves ahead. He looked at David. The board is convening for an emergency session in 1 hour via teleconference, David replied. Your return is a force majeure event. Genevieve's proxy is null and void the second you are on that call. We have the evidence to have her and her brother removed from their positions immediately. And her assets? Annalise asked, thinking of the penthouse, the cars, the couture gowns. Our team filed an injunction at 6 a.m. this morning, David said with a thin smile. By now, every bank account, every credit card, every asset tied to Genevieve Dubois Beaumont has been frozen pending the fraud investigation. When she tries to pay for her morning coffee, her card will be declined. Robert looked at the sales agreement for his patents, his fist clenching. Omnicorp. Their CEO is a man named Wallace, a vulture of a man. He must have known this was a hostile, clandestine deal. He's a shark who smelled blood in the water, David agreed. He won't be happy when this falls apart. Good, Robert said, a dangerous glint in his eye. Let him be unhappy. When we're done, Genevieve won't be the only one with problems. He turned to his daughter, his expression softening slightly. This is going to be a war, Annalise. I know, she said, her voice filled with a newfound strength. I'm not a little girl anymore, Dad. Let's get to work. She pulled a chair up to the table, her eyes scanning the documents of betrayal. The girl who had hidden in an alcove at a party just hours before was gone. In her place was a Beaumont ready to fight for her name, her father, and their future. The fallout was not a quiet affair. It was a nuclear explosion in the heart of New York society and the financial world. The story was simply too sensational to be contained. Nicholas Chandler's eyewitness account of the scene at the gala, published under the headline, "The Resurrection of Robert Beaumont," went viral before sunrise. It was the appetizer. The main course was a feast of scandal. The emergency board meeting of Beaumont Innovations was a bloodbath. Robert, appearing via a secure video link from the plaza, looked every bit the commander returning to his army. He laid out Genevieve's treachery with cold, brutal efficiency, supported by David Chen's irrefutable documentation. The board, many of whom had been placated and deceived by Genevieve for years, were aghast. Within 30 minutes, Genevieve and Luc Dubois were summarily removed from all positions, their corporate access revoked, and a full-scale internal audit was launched. For Genevieve, the world ended not with a bang, but with the silent, humiliating rejection of a credit card. She had woken up late, nursing a migraine from the previous night's public disgrace, and had tried to order an elaborate breakfast from Petrosian. The transaction was denied. Her second card, her private Amex Centurion, was also declined. The panic began to set in. When she tried to leave the Olympian Tower, she was met in the lobby by two stern-faced men in suits, accompanied by Frank Connolly. They were representatives from the board of the co-op. "Mrs. Beaumont," one of them said, his voice devoid of its usual deference, "there appears to be an issue with your residency status. Given the injunction on your assets and the ongoing investigation, the board has voted to suspend all your privileges pending review. This includes access to the building's staff amenities and house accounts." The penthouse, which was owned by the company as a corporate residence, was no longer hers to use. They gave her 30 minutes to pack a single suitcase and vacate the premises. The scene was a pathetic parody of her former glory. Genevieve, the Queen of New York, was reduced to frantically throwing priceless couture into a Louis Vuitton suitcase, her hands shaking with rage and fear. Madeline, who had been crying in her room all morning, simply stared, unable to process the speed of their downfall. They were escorted out through a service exit to avoid the horde of reporters now camped outside the main entrance. A taxi, a common yellow cab, was hailed for them. As Genevieve stood on the curb, watching her entire life being locked away behind her, she saw a news van's television screen playing an interview. It was Nicholas Chandler speaking with authority about the scale of the Beaumont fraud. She had been ruined, and the whole world was watching. The consequences cascaded. Luxury brands that had once showered her with gifts now wanted their loaned jewelry and gowns back. Invitations to upcoming charity events were rescinded via terse emails. The friends who had once flocked to her side now wouldn't even answer her calls. In the world she had so carefully constructed, to lose your money and your power was to cease to exist. Madeline's fate was in its own way just as brutal. Her fiancé, the heir to a banking fortune, called her that afternoon. The conversation was brief. The wedding was off. His family could not be associated with such a scandal. Her social media, once a curated shrine to her perfect life, became a cesspool of hateful comments and memes. Her friends abandoned her overnight. Within a week, stripped of her allowance and access to any funds, she was filling out a job application to be a sales assistant at a mid-range department store, a place she once wouldn't have even walked past. For Luc Dubois, the unraveling was international. French authorities, tipped off by the U.S. District Attorney's Office, arrested him at his lavish apartment on the Avenue Montaigne. He was charged with fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. His web of shell corporations collapsed, and he faced the prospect of spending the next decade in prison. Robert Beaumont, however, was not finished. His next target was Omnicorp. He personally called its CEO, Wallace. "You tried to buy my company's soul from a thief, Wallace," Robert said, his voice dangerously calm over the phone. "You knew the deal was dirty. You thought I was out of the picture. That was a miscalculation." Robert's legal team filed a lawsuit against Omnicorp for tortious interference, accusing them of conspiring to damage Beaumont Innovations. But more than that, Robert waged a war in the press. He gave an exclusive interview to the Wall Street Journal, detailing Omnicorp's predatory practices. Beaumont Innovations stock, which had initially dipped, roared back to life on the news of its founder's return. Omnicorp's, however, took a nosedive as investors grew nervous about the scandal and the impending legal battle. Wallace the Vulture had been outmaneuvered. Annalise watched all of this unfold not as a spectator, but as an active participant. She sat by her father's side during the legal calls, helped draft press releases, and used her deep knowledge of the company, gleaned from years of listening to her father as a child, to identify key areas that Genevieve had neglected. The quiet girl from the gala was gone. A sharp, insightful young woman was in her place, her confidence growing with every small victory. One evening, about a month after the gala, Annalise was working late with her father in a temporary office they had set up. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from the dean of her program at Columbia. The Starlight Foundation, in the wake of the scandal and Genevieve's removal from their board, had received a new anonymous donation. A massive one. It was enough to fully endow her arts program for the next 50 years. The endowment was to be named the Eleanor Beaumont Memorial Fund, after her mother. Annalise looked at her father, her eyes shining with tears. He simply smiled. "Your mother loved art," he said quietly. "She would have wanted this. We're not just going to rebuild. We're going to build something better." The web of deceit had been torn apart. Now it was time to weave something new. 6 months felt like a lifetime. The raw, biting chill of the autumn night that had changed everything had thawed, giving way to the gentle, optimistic warmth of a New York spring. The city's insatiable appetite for drama had moved on, chasing new scandals and fresh headlines. But within the quiet, sun-drenched rooms of a stately brownstone on the Upper West Side, the Beaumonts were not moving on. They were moving forward. The Olympian Tower penthouse, a monument to Genevieve's cold ambition, and the site of Robert's gilded cage had been sold. The proceeds were folded back into the company's charitable trust. Robert had no desire to set foot in a place haunted by such profound betrayal. Their new home was its antithesis. It was a place of character, with floors that creaked with history, and tall windows that invited the afternoon light to dance across shelves overflowing with books. The air smelled of old paper, brewing coffee, and Annalise's small pots of lavender, a stark, welcome contrast to the sterile, professionally arranged florals that had been replaced every 48 hours in their former life. Here life was lived in, not curated. The legal storms had passed, leaving behind a landscape irrevocably altered. The sentences had been handed down with a finality that brooked no argument. Luc Dubois, the architect of the financial drain, was learning the harsh realities of a French prison, his sentence a grim 12-year affair. Genevieve's fate was a masterpiece of karmic irony. She who had worshipped at the altar of public image had been stripped bare before the world she desperately sought to impress. Facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, she accepted a plea deal, 7 years in a federal correctional facility. Annalise had seen a surreptitiously snapped photo of her in an online tabloid. The woman in the drab, ill-fitting jumpsuit was a stranger, her face stripped of its defiant makeup, her hair dull and unkempt, her eyes hollowed out by the shocking totality of her defeat. Annalise had expected to feel a surge of triumph, a sharp satisfaction. Instead, she felt only a quiet, melancholy sense of closure, the turning of a final, heavy page. Madeleine's fall was less dramatic, but perhaps more profound. Her world built on the currency of her name, and her looks had declared bankruptcy. The fiancé, the trust fund, the fair-weather friends, all had vanished in the scandal's inferno. One afternoon, Annalise had been leaving a bookstore in Soho when she saw her. Madeleine was stepping off a crowded subway train, the same mode of transport Annalise had taken on the night of the gala. She looked tired, her expensive, but now season-old coat looking out of place in her new reality. Their eyes met for a fleeting second across the bustling street. There was no sneer in Madeleine's gaze, no flicker of superiority. There was only a weary, dawning comprehension of a world that did not bend to her will. Annalise gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and walked on, understanding that some lessons can only be learned in the harsh classroom of consequence. Beaumont Innovations, once on the verge of being gutted, was now more robust than ever. Robert, with the fire of purpose rekindled in his eyes, was a formidable presence even in a more advisory role. He had regained much of his strength, though the elegant wooden cane remained a constant companion, a quiet testament to his ordeal and his survival. But the true renaissance of the company was Annalise. She had not only completed her degree at Columbia, graduating with high honors, but had also thrown herself into the heart of her father's empire, not as an heiress-in-waiting, but as a genuine innovator. She now chaired the board of the newly and massively endowed Eleanor Beaumont Memorial Fund. "We're not just going to rebuild," her father had told her in the early days of their reunion. "We're going to build something better." Annalise had taken those words as her personal mission. She sat in boardrooms now, the only person under 50 in a sea of grey suits, and spoke with a calm authority that commanded respect. She didn't just approve budgets. She championed ideas, pushing the company's philanthropic efforts away from performative check-writing and towards tangible, impactful programs that reflected her mother's passion for the arts and her own desire for meaningful change. Their relationship had been the most precious thing salvaged from the wreckage. The chasm of misunderstanding had been filled with hours of conversation, shared meals, and comfortable silences. He saw in her not the little girl he needed to protect, but a capable, intelligent woman who was his partner. She in turn saw not a distant icon or a tragic victim, but her dad, a man of immense strength and quiet vulnerability. Her world had expanded in other ways too. Nicholas Chandler, the kind-eyed journalist who had offered her a glass of champagne when she was at her lowest, had become a cherished part of her life. Their friendship, forged in that strange, charged moment at the gala, had slowly, naturally blossomed into love. He was her anchor to a world outside of boardrooms and balance sheets. With him, she wasn't Annalise Beaumont, the reclaimed heiress. She was just Annalise, a girl who loved browsing dusty bookshops and arguing about the endings of movies. He had been beside her through the trials, a steady presence who celebrated her victories and understood the scars they had left behind. One brilliant afternoon in May, Annalise found herself once more on the iconic steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The sun was warm on her face, and a gentle breeze rustled from the leaves of the trees along Fifth Avenue. This time, there were no flashing bulbs of paparazzi hungry for a scandal, but the respectful cameras of the city's legitimate press. This time, she was not alone, sneaking in a side entrance. She stood at a podium at the very top of the stairs, her father smiling by her side, Nicholas watching her with pride from the front row. She was there to announce the Foundation's inaugural partnership, a sweeping initiative with the museum to fund and develop technology and digital arts programs for every public high school in the 5 boroughs. She wore a smart, elegant suit of navy blue, a deliberate, quiet nod to the dress her mother had worn, the armor she had donned for her own battle 6 months ago. But this was not armor. It was a uniform of her own choosing. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying over the assembled crowd. She didn't read from a script, but spoke from the heart, her passion for the project evident in every word. She spoke of her mother's belief that art was not a luxury, but a necessity. She spoke of the power of technology not just to create wealth, but to unlock human potential. As she concluded her speech to a wave of sincere applause, she looked out at the city. She saw the faces watching her, and she felt a profound sense of peace. The girl who had stood in an alcove, trembling with humiliation and loneliness, felt like a character from a distant story. Yet she knew that the woman at the podium existed only because of that girl's single, desperate act of defiance. She had walked into that gala alone, an outcast, expecting only to be broken. Her father's dramatic entrance had saved her that night, a stunning moment of public vindication. But the true victory she now understood was quieter and far more personal. It was in the rebuilding day by day. It was in the forging of a future she now commanded. The ultimate luxury wasn't the diamonds or the couture she had once envied. It was the love of a father regained, the trust of a partner earned, and the deep, unshakable knowledge of her own strength. She was Annalise Beaumont, and she had built her own foundation, stronger than any stone right here in the heart of the city that had tried to cast her out. She was finally and truly home. Annalise's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't measured by wealth or social status, but by the courage to stand tall even when you feel completely alone. It shows us that appearances can be deceiving, and behind the most polished facades can lie the darkest secrets. She was dismissed, underestimated, and cast aside, but she held on to the one thing her stepmother could never take: her integrity and the quiet belief that the truth mattered. Her journey from a lonely girl in a borrowed dress to a confident leader teaches us that justice, even when it's delayed, can be incredibly satisfying, and that the strongest foundations are built not on lies, but on love and resilience. What part of Annalise's story resonated with you the most? Do you believe Genevieve and Madeline truly got what they deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of karmic retribution and triumphant justice moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with a friend who loves a dramatic tale. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for listening.